Bonjour, bienvenue. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this gathering of the heritage sector on Bill C-23. My name is Natalie Bull. I'm Executive Director of the National Trust, and I'm joined here with members of the working group that formed after the previous session that we hosted on Bill C-23 earlier in the summer. Before we get going today, I just want to acknowledge traditional territory. I'm participating today from New Brunswick, the traditional territory of the Wolastoqey people, here on the banks of the river they call the Wolastoq. And I know that all of us here are participating from Indigenous lands across the country, and it's our privilege to reflect on the histories, languages, and cultures of Métis, First Nations, and Inuit communities whose presence enriches our shared heritage. Today will be, I think most of us will probably be participating in English, but some of the slides and text we do have in both official languages, and feel free to participate in the language of your choice, either in the chat or verbally. So this is a gathering and not a webinar. So it's an informal opportunity for us to get together and share and move the marker forward on this particular issue around Bill C-23. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have everyone's faces on the screen today, but if you are participating and would like to be promoted to a panelist and be part of the conversation, just send a note in the chat, and we'll be able to do that and let you speak as part of the group on the screen. Otherwise, feel free to make comments in the chat, ask questions, and I'm hoping all the faces on the screen will be part of the conversation here today. So I think that's our housekeeping to get going. The National Trust, so these gatherings are an important part of the work that we do, I think, in bringing the sector together. And as I mentioned, we had an earlier gathering on Bill C-23 in the summer that really spawned an incredible working group, a network of people from across the country, individuals and people representing organizations, different aspects of the sector. And I think it was really an incredible, it continues to be an incredible example of collaboration that has led to some really good results. And I just wanted a shout out to Heritage Ottawa, the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, the Indigenous Heritage Circle, Ecamos Canada, and individuals like Christina Cameron and Mark Donnet, the folks participating from St. John's who've been involved with a National Historic Site and have some really personal perspectives on this bill. Emma Lang joining us from the Historic Trust of Nova Scotia Heritage Trust. So it's just been a really great coming together of different perspectives around this work. So our agenda for today, we will sort of briefly do an overview of the federal role in historic places. This is the first piece of federal legislation or federal action around heritage for many years. We'll quickly review the scope of this particular bill, look at what's good about the bill, share the 5 amendments that the working group is proposing, and then end with a conversation about how we need all of you on the call today to be part of an engagement strategy to move these amendments forward. So on the next slide, so just a brief overview. So I think it's interesting to remind ourselves that in 2016, there was a private member's bill proposed to create a tax incentive for historic places, and that bill failed. That private member's bill failed, but it did result in some interesting work by the Environment Committee that resulted in a report called Preserving Canada's Heritage, the Foundation for Tomorrow. And it contained a number of recommendations about what the federal role should be for historic places in Canada. And then that was in 2017. And then in 2019, the mandate letter for the Minister of Environment included this charge to work with the Minister of Canadian Heritage to provide clearer direction on how national heritage places should be designated and preserved, and to develop comprehensive legislation on federally owned heritage places. And so that work was ultimately provided funding in the federal budget for Parks Canada to move ahead with that work. What's interesting is that this this work reflected in Bill C-23, which had first reading in June this year, actually responds to the first 6 recommendations in that Environment Committee report. So I want to be optimistic and think that government will now methodically move through all of those other recommendations. And then the next 2 in line are for assured funding for National Historic Sites and for a tax incentive for heritage buildings in private ownership. So let's be optimistic and assume that's what's coming next. And I think if we do a good job of providing solid, clear, and reasonable recommendations on Bill C-23, it puts the sector in a good position to move forward on those other asks and to work collaboratively with government. So any thoughts or comments from panelists, or any questions or comments from others participating before we move on to the scope of the bill? So I see a question from Michael. How do we contact the working group? So you can do that through the National Trust. So we've been kind of convening those calls, and many of them are here on the panel today. So we'll make sure that you have the ability to get in touch with us in a follow-up email. We'll also share the recording from this conversation today to everyone who registered. Thanks, Michael. Any comments from the group about before we move into the scope of the bill? Christina.
I think it might be just worth mentioning that in the 2021 mandate letter, the collaboration with Canadian Heritage was no longer there, just as because it was a bit different, the second mandate.
Oh, great, thanks. I looked through the 2021 mandate letter and I couldn't actually see it at all in my quick scan.
It's one line. You have to look carefully.
Great. So on to the scope of the bill. So I just have a print of the bill in front of me, and others, I don't know if someone else, Mark, would you like to run us through the scope of the bill?
Oh my goodness. Actually, the quick answer is no. I'd rather you did it, but that's another story. Essentially, what Bill C-23 does is that whereas it provides a statutory framework for the federal activities, as opposed to the previous policy framework. People will remember that the federal government had a federal piece of legislation called the Historic Sites and Monuments Act. The nomenclature changes. These move from being historic sites to being historic places. And in fact, there's a proliferation of other terms that are also inserted into the bill. So one of the challenges will be to figure out what term refers to what. The second thing that people will remember from the longstanding federal policy is that there was something called the Federal Heritage Buildings Review Office. The two primary characteristics: the Federal Heritage Buildings Review Office, or FHBRO, would be consulted in the event of various activities which could affect the property of federal departments and agencies. Federal crown corporations were in a limbo. Organizations like Canada Post were not directly covered, but in any event, that was the federal institution entrenched in policy, not in statute. So what then occurs is that now there is going to be a new system in which ultimately there are certain responsibilities wind up being routed through the through the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, ultimately to the minister. But again, the only obligation, as under the previous policy, is an obligation to consult. It does not mean that the decision-making is binding on the department. It simply means that a given custodial department must consult with this institution. Another feature of the 4 sentences that appear in Bill C-23 referring to protection is that under the previous system, people would look at the the standards and guidelines that had been published by Parks Canada. Under the new system, they shall similarly be required to take account of the standards and guidelines, but under the new legislation, there is no obligation, as in the case of the previous policy, to actually comply with the standards and guidelines. Now, the lead feature of the new bill, which appeared in all of the materials that were published by the federal government back in June, when the bill was tabled, is that there will now be an official ex officio type representation by various Indigenous organizations on the Historic Sites and Monuments Board. The Historic Sites and Monuments Board retains its title. It doesn't move from being historic site to historic place. It remains historic site. But up until now, the structure of the board was, shall we say, very, very rigid, very awkward, and there was really some legitimate complaint on the part of a lot of Indigenous organizations across Canada that it really didn't accommodate their viewpoint. Now there is, shall we say, a new structure which does represent, or is supposed to represent, the Indigenous organizations. The difficulty there is that this is, after all, a strictly advisory body. And so it doesn't have any statutory powers per se, and it won't under the new system either. So that is the major accomplishment of Bill C-23. And if there are any people who have any addenda that they'd like to throw in, please feel free. I should add that one of the concerns that existed both among Indigenous organizations and the rest of the heritage community generally is that there was not a single word of Bill C-23 that was disclosed to any of these organizations in the draft form before this bill was presented in the House of Commons. And there are a number of organizations that feel that procedurally, this is a very peculiar way to proceed with something which is being done in the name of inclusiveness and transparency. Back to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's a good overview of what this bill addresses, and you got into some of the positives and some of the negatives, which is good segue into that discussion. So basically, at a high level, I think we can say that this bill addresses the designation of national historic sites and the protection or the treatment of federally owned or regulated historic places. So, and thank you, Emma, for sharing a link to the bill in the chat. So I think we can, unless there are any questions, or if any of the panelists would like to say anything else about scope, we can get into sharing positive aspects of the bill. And so I'm sort of quoting here from the draft document that the working group has put together. And maybe I'll just cut to the chase a bit and share with everyone that the intention is ultimately to share a document that has had some input from at least a couple of the elected officials we've been working with who are very interested in the future of this bill. So that's a next step, but ultimately the goal will be to have as many individuals and heritage organizations support the final recommendations as possible. And I would say too, like what the working group has said repeatedly is we really want to be singing from the same songbook and not coming from many different directions, all identifying different issues with this bill. That as much as possible, we really want to present a united front that is well reasoned and provides a clear rationale and clear recommendations to how this bill can be improved. And ultimately, the goal is that these could be seen as friendly amendments that are taken on board by government and brought forward as this bill evolves. So at the moment, the bill has had first reading. We're still waiting to find out when it will receive second reading, and then be referred to committee. And at that point, key organizations and individuals would have an opportunity to appear before the Environment Committee to be part of the discussions and to present the recommendations coming out of the sector. So that's part of our goal today, is really just to bring more people in to this conversation, share where the working group has landed, and ideally keep moving forward with the united front. So positive aspects, Mark already mentioned some of them. The bill harmonizes the current patchwork of legislation that affects federal heritage properties and the designation of places of national significance. It clarifies the government's role. It proposes a public register, something new that will give the public access to information on designations, on condition and on planned action for federal historic places. So a step toward consultation, but not quite consultation. It responds to the TRC calls to action 79(1) and 2 by adding Indigenous representation to the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, as Mark mentioned, and providing an Indigenous-led process for including places in the public register. And it enshrines in legislation the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada and the World Heritage Convention. So would anyone like to say anything about those positive aspects of the bill? Or add anything I've missed? Great, so let's, oh, sorry. Thanks, Leslie.
We've tossed back and forth by email, but not resolved. So whether the issue of accountability is covered by the workings of the register. So the register, it's not the Historic Places Register. It's a completely different animal. It is simply a register of federally owned and managed heritage properties. Owner departments will be required to post actions intended for those properties on that register. So we have been asking ourselves, is that sufficient for accountability? Just wanted to highlight that one.
Thanks, Leslie. And I think in our recommendations, we basically say that we're recommending something more proactive.
More robust, yeah.
Yeah. And perhaps another addendum on the positive side of ledger, and that is that 2022 marks the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention. And among the various announcements that were made back in June by the federal government, they announced that the purpose of this legislation was, among other things, to implement the World Heritage Convention.
Great, no, that's a good point, Mark. Okay, so let's dive into the 5 key amendments recommended by the working group. And we've got them on a slide, the issue and the recommendation, and then the following slide provides that language in French. And Holly, I might just ask you to toggle back and forth periodically, so we're kind of sharing the languages on the screen. So, and I don't know if would any of the panelists like to present this first issue and recommendation? I'm happy to do it, but I also you're all the smartest people in the room.
I can read it. I'm not sure I'm the expert, but I'm happy to read it and at least start the ball rolling. So this one is, we think the need to ensure that federal historic places that are of national historic significance or national interest are not excluded from statutory protection. And the recommendation is to amend the bill to make it applicable to all places of national historic significance or national interest under federal control, including those owned by Crown corporations, to archaeology or federal lands underwater. So this is partly addressing an issue which certainly in Atlantic Canada is a major issue, where not all federally designated sites are actually owned by the federal government. And we see that as a major concern for for a huge number, a vast number of very significant national sites.
Great. Thanks, Emma. And Christina. Oh, you're
Oh.
muted.
Sorry, on the archaeology issue, it's odd that the standards and guidelines actually are going to be under statutory protection, and they speak about archaeology for federal lands underwater, but it's not in the definition in the bill as it now sits. So I think it's an oversight, but we do need to correct it, because if it's not there, it won't get regulated.
Great. No, thanks, Christina. Interesting that the Environment Committee report actually stated that all those other places need to be included, that we need to make sure that crown corporations are included. So we're reminding government of that that requirement. So, and anything else to say about this first recommendation? And in my conversations with government about our recommendation, this may not all happen at once. It may not be possible to have all of the crown corporations signed on to the schedule that's included with the bill at the outset. So we'll need to decide whether that's whether we're prepared to allow that the number of crown corporations included to be increased over time. But I think our intent is clear. Okay, so let's go ahead to the next one. So this is about accountability, monitoring, and reporting. So currently the bill doesn't say anything about who's actually going to be watching what happens. And I think we know from experience that unless there is regular reporting and oversight of something like this, things can fall through the cracks, places can be demolished by neglect. I think one of the strengths of our document that we're not able to share at the moment, but we'll definitely be sharing out with the sector, is that we've included real examples from the past of places that have not been adequately protected under current regimes. So that's a way for us to underscore the importance of making these amendments. So we're suggesting an annual report to Parliament potentially from the minister on the state of places covered under this bill. So any comments or questions about that recommendation? Christina.
Yeah, I would make the comment that it's kind of intensification, but it is linked to the register. I'm coming back to Leslie's comment. I mean, this is, if the register were totally up to date and fulsome enough, this might not be necessary, but probably because systems don't get updated properly most of the time, especially after a few years, it's probably a good idea to keep this as an add-on piece.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, so let's go ahead to the third recommendation. And so this really gets to the process. And I think in discussing the process proposed in the bill, which as I think, Mark, you mentioned this in your remarks earlier, that basically I think we looked back to Auditor General reports about the state of historic places regulated by government. And one of the criticisms was that the system that's still currently in place lacked any ability for anyone to compel departments or agencies to do what they needed to do to protect designated places. And so we really recognize that in its current form, this bill risks perpetuating that same weakness because it really just says, as Mark told us, that custodians of these designated places should take the standards and guidelines into account and consult Parks Canada, but really nothing more definitive than that. So our recommendations are that in order to make sure Bill C-23 does what it's intended to do, that it needs to provide for oversight and public consultation on federal historic places. So we're recommending that in addition to consulting with Parks Canada, which is not a bad thing, and will be helpful, that there should be oversight of the process of proposing changes to these places by a knowledgeable third party that isn't a custodian of property, so is not subject to the bill itself in its own management of property, who can review proposed projects at subject properties. So we're saying this could be assigned to the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, which is already implicated in this bill, and it could be a role added to them, and they could seek expert advice as needed to play this role. And then a second point, the notion of consultation. So as we just mentioned, currently there is the potential for the public to monitor what's happening with federal heritage places through this proposed new register, but we're recommending means of providing the public, other levels of government, including Indigenous governments and heritage organizations, inviting them to offer their input. And we were inspired in looking at this by the system in place in the US, where there is actually a third party created specifically to provide oversight and to ensure that parties are involved appropriately in the process of reviewing changes. So Hunter, you wanted to make a comment.
I just wanted to note that there's considerable complementarity between this recommendation and the preceding one regarding accountability, the greater transparency in the processes that we're encouraging the government to adopt, and the greater prospect for the public to ensure appropriate accountability. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Hunter. And then a third point we brought in, sorry, was there another comment?
Yeah, here.
Sure, Mark.
Just to say that this recommendation and the others are remarkably consistent with not only the recommendations that had come forward from the parliamentary committee in 2017, but also with not one, not two, but three sets of reports from the Auditor General of Canada calling for an increase in the intensity of the legislation. And also in June of 2022, the International Law Association came down with both feet on the question of providing oversight and particularly the participation of interested and affected parties. So I think that the people who drafted these recommendations are to be commended because they are entirely consistent with the relevant thinking.
Great, thanks, Mark. There was a comment in the chat about being clear that if there's a third party that they do need to have expertise in dealing with historic places, and we could strengthen that in our recommendations. And then I think someone asked, am I understanding correctly, a list of the organizations who were part of the working group, and happy to include that in the follow-up note. Again, many of the reps are here on the screen today. And then there is a third point under this third recommendation, which is about compliance with UNDRIP. And so I just want a shout out to the Indigenous Heritage Circle participation in the review of this bill. And I think we can all learn a lot from this. In fact, UNDRIP confirms the rights of Indigenous peoples to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritages, including traditional knowledges and traditional cultural expressions. For example, UNDRIP requires governments to consult and cooperate in good faith to obtain free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before adopting legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. So we're integrating input from the Indigenous Heritage Circle and this lack of compliance with UNDRIP into the recommendations. And I think, I mean, what's interesting for me too is that I think all of us as Canadians who, as taxpayers, own these properties that government is the steward of. We have rights to be consulted and to be aware of what's happening with these places that matter to all of us. So I think it's really interesting for us to incorporate that reference to UNDRIP in this discussion about consultation and the process. So that's the recommendation is to amend Bill C-23 to identify a non-custodian third party and to allow for participation by interested and affected parties. Great. So then I think we can move on to the fourth recommendation, although I'm just checking the chat here. Yeah, that's great. So this fourth recommendation, so I'm going to ask maybe either Mark or Christina to talk about the issue and the recommendation, if you don't mind.
I'll be really brief. This is a very wordy statute. It contains a multiplicity of different terms which are perilously similar, but must have different nuances. Otherwise, they wouldn't all appear in the statute. This is going to be a nightmare for any lawyers who have to work with it later on. So I certainly support the idea of a thorough house cleaning of the language of the statute, because otherwise nobody is going to want to work with it.
Thanks, Mark. Christina.
Yeah, and I would add, thank you, Mark. I agree. The framing of the whole piece of legislation is under Historic Places of Canada. And there's no problem with that because it's a mishmash of different things that are in there. However, when you drill down, there are different parts to those historic places that have big brand recognition. And I would say the National Historic Sites of Canada is one. And it sort of disappears. If you look at the back end of this very long bill, you'll see that the words National Historic Site of Canada, those words are struck out of every place in the Parks Canada Agency Act. So it actually disappears. The issue is there's not only a label recognition federally, and the amount of money we've spent on signage would be one example, but that is writ large across the country because the number of National Historic Sites of Canada that are in private hands and have roadside signage and all that, it's huge, and they're publications and everything. So I think just on a cost basis, it's very serious. And more important probably is on a recognition basis that these are the ones that have been isolated or chosen to be really the most important in the country. And so I think that we can accommodate that through definitions that link these different parts to Historic Places of Canada. Because I don't see taking every National Historic Site in the country and saying from now on you have to call it Bellevue Historic Places of Canada. This will be a killer. Like from a PR point of view, this will go nowhere. So, and from a cost point of view. So but I think it can be fixed, and I think there's some sympathy for this within parks. So I think we can fix some of these things through amendments, and we just have to be very careful to make sure we've covered the ground. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And
it's in Parks' self-interest to do this.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and we have been assured by our colleagues at Parks Canada that there was no intent to impact the term National Historic Site, but currently it does. There is certainly confusion created by the wording of the Act. One additional piece of this fourth recommendation that I want to bring attention to, and I think for me, it was a real example of how having people with different perspectives and interests as part of this working group conversation was so valuable. And Leslie, I think it was you and your concerns for the Central Experimental Farm and learning from what happened there. we eventually realized that this act was written, this bill is written as a buildings bill that just talks about buildings, but not their settings or their landscapes. And so
right.
we sort of had that epiphany, and that also is part of this recommendation to ensure that the definitions don't just cover buildings, but are also includes in the scope the settings and their the sites and settings. So did you want to say anything about that, Leslie?
That's quite true. It is curious
Yeah.
that the whole building bias still survives, even though we've been designating landscapes for decades now.
Yeah.
So yes, this kind of clarification is very important. And as someone said, why are you trying to fix something that isn't broken? This is a gimme, I hope. But I am concerned of where this idea came from. I think that there may be a surprise here for us, but so launch the surprise on us. We need to know.
Great.
Well, FIBRO was always limited to the footprint.
Yeah.
So that may be where it's coming from. The Historic Sites and Monuments Board does not deal with footprint. It looks beyond that.
Great. So let's move along to the fifth recommendation. So this is our fifth and final recommendation. And this is about disposal of property. So, and I think we know through experience that the federal government through the Canada Lands Company process has typically been ensuring some form of protection for heritage places that leave the federal inventory. And similarly, those of us experienced with the Heritage Railway Stations Protection Act know that often there is a requirement for either a protective covenant registered on title or for designation under using provincial or territorial heritage legislation. So given that this is already commonly accepted practice, but is not built into the bill, we're recommending that those protocols and regulations be part of the process of what's covered under the bill. So did anyone want to add anything to that? So just checking the chat here. Thanks to Lise, for looking at the comparing French to English. So those are the 5 recommendations, and maybe I'll just chat a bit while people are absorbing those. And I think this, in many ways, the conversations during the working group sessions has opened up the need for obviously other action on the part of the federal government. And I think on the next slide, so I actually wanted to begin our brief with our statements about what we need next from the federal government, but I was convinced to move it to the end to start more specifically with comments on the bill. But we end the bill with some language about referring back to the Environment Committee report and the other recommendations and kind of summarizing what's important for the sector. Great for the government to get its own house in order in doing this work. But I think these other, what we would call them asks, are short form in talking about them at the National Trust. These are the kinds of things we've typically been including in our recommendations for federal budget allocations and in our recommendations to the minister. And I'm really excited about the work we've done with this working group and to really move forward collaboratively in the same kind of way on these other measures that are needed to move the sector forward and put older buildings on a level playing field. So we won't get into these today, but I think it's important for us as a sector to be clear on what it is we expect of our federal government. So, and I don't know, Chris, are you on the line? Did you want to say anything about this and maybe a reference to other issues circulating especially in Ontario right now?
Yeah, I think thanks, Natalie. Chris here at the National Trust. I guess the one thing that comes up as another bill thinking about other issues that are sort of swirling around, is this another bill, just to provide more confusion? It's called Bill 23, and it's in Ontario, as opposed to C-23, which is the federal level. There's one now in Ontario, which is called the More Homes Built Faster Act, which just came out about a week ago. And it provides proposes sweeping changes to land use approval system in the province, and has impacts on 9 different acts, including those around conservation, natural heritage conservation areas, and being able to breeze over some of the regulations and requirements to look at those before planning developments happen. The impacts that are probably most concerning to us is the changes proposed to the Ontario Heritage Act. And it's interesting because it's seeing, you know, heritage as a barrier to housing creation. And I think it's something we need to think broadly about. I mean, that kind of notion of heritage conservation work. But it also sort of undermines a lot of the kind of the things that are happening within the heritage conservation movement around the recognition of places beyond those currently recognized by in this Bill 23, proposing that 2 stringent criteria for heritage conservation designation need to be met for buildings to be designated, rather than just 1, which puts a lot of barriers in the places of places of more modest places, vernacular places from marginalized groups, which may not meet the tests around certain kinds of architectural value, but have lots of other kinds of value. So there's many different things happening. And so it's interesting hearing about the federal role where they're trying to tighten up processes. There's a general tenor that I think that we're seeing, and it may be coming to a province near you, around loosening up of some of the aspects around heritage. I don't know whether some others want to jump in. It's deeply concerning, and there's going to be lots of discussion over the next month while they consider this Bill 23. Maybe, I don't know if somebody else on the panel wants to jump in. You've also been following it. I know David Fleming and others have, for sure.
No, that's great, Chris. Certainly lots in play these days for heritage. Maybe we may have a bit of time later in the, oh, sorry, go ahead, David, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to just ask Emma. It seems to me the same thing has been happening in Nova Scotia recently, where the housing, the need for more housing seems to have been trumping heritage conservation. It's almost like your premier has been consulting with Hereford.
Yeah, there's definitely, we're beginning to see ripples coming this way, which is not super surprising. The big thing right now is there's a move by the, excuse me, by the premier to try and change our municipal act regarding Halifax to facilitate development in a way to give basically developers carte blanche for anything, which is incredibly concerning from a heritage perspective. While it's only currently, this would only currently impact the Halifax region, we expect that it then sets the precedent for changing it across the province. And since we're seeing increasing interest in developers outside of Halifax with our huge population bump, it's incredible. It's actually quite terrifying for us. And since we are a smaller community, we're trying to sort of figure out quite how to respond. But all of this has just come up in the last week, and we expect it to keep rolling. There's certainly other movements from the where the premier might be trying to shift other things, which would also, again, it would be following a bit of the Ontario playbook in ways that we would rather not.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it like that. But yeah, I think what's going on in Ontario is certainly going to influence what happens everywhere, which is scary. But that's what the response to federal legislation is. That's why we need stronger federal legislation, so that can keep us can protect where there is able to for federal influence to be.
Great. Thanks, David and Emma. So getting back to our Bill C-23, getting to the engagement strategy, and I do see a comment here from Michael Smith about, which I think is about level of resources invested in moving ahead with designations or looking at places that should receive national identification as nationally significant resources. I'm not sure. It's a good question, and Christina, you might be the one who would know whether I'm not sure how we would work that into recommendations on this particular piece of legislation, but I don't know if you saw that comment in the chat.
I was thinking about it too, the comment from Michael. In the end, I think this is where we as a community have to be alert and send back, because the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada operates in response to public request. And this would be up to us, I think, collectively to notice that Bill Reid, for example, as Michael has shown, that he needs the places he's associated with, they need to be brought back and examined for their own inherent validity or significance, so that they are protected before it's too late. And I think that one will really depend on the eyes and ears of the community.
Great, thanks, Christina. So with regard to engagement, the reason we brought all of you together today in this gathering is to really talk about how what the sector can do now. And so, as I mentioned, the working group has put together a document. We've been working also with MP John Aldag, and Heritage Ottawa has been working with MP Yasser Naqvi. Both have been giving us good advice, and so the latest advice, they're also watching the schedule and helping make sure that we don't miss our opportunity to be part of discussions at the Environment Committee when the bill is referred to committee. So I think where we're at is to finalize the text around these recommendations, share that with one or both of those MPs for their feedback. John Aldag has offered to take our recommendations forward internally and to discuss them in the minister's office to see whether our amendments could be considered friendly amendments taken on by the government itself. And the goal is that there are MPs who've been briefed and are aware of these recommendations, that this could be part of discussion at second reading and then referred to committee. So ultimately, the goal is that these amendments are brought to the committee and get taken on as amendments to the bill. Is there anything else? So ultimately, what we'll be asking of the sector is to look at a finalized text and to sign on. So I'm signaling that you may, those of you who are involved with heritage organizations, you may, if you need the approval of your board of directors to support something like this, you can start that conversation now and share these, the fact that a working group has been putting recommendations together. Ultimately, we will share a link to the document online. And with a form that you can fill in, basically indicating your desire to support these amendments. And so according to John Aldag, it would be very powerful for government to know that heritage organizations across the country, number one, are supportive of government doing this work. I think we have to be very positive that this may not be the perfect bill in its current form, but it's in our best interests, I think, to take a collaborative approach to government. There are more things we need government to do. So being positive about this and making very clear and specific and reasonable recommendations for improvement is certainly something that I think we will be recognized for doing. So all that to say, be prepared. We don't know the timing of this bill. It's possible that it could reach second reading before the Christmas holidays. So if you can just be conscious of that coming, watch for a message from the National Trust. If you are interested, please go ahead and signal that in the chat, and we'll make sure that you receive a message and a link to the document when we're ready to start collecting signatures. So any questions or comments? Leslie, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Natalie. It helps to lay out how we operate going forward as a concerted group. It's also worth everyone's while to know that we can also individually, our individual organizations or as individuals, make representations to this committee, which will convene subsequent to second reading. And I think once we're closer to the date, it would be important for this group to sit down and talk about how we would coordinate our presentations. So for instance, from the perspective of Heritage Ottawa, what we would be doing is we would be saying, Chair, we are supporting the recommendations as brought forward by National Trust. It is particularly important for Heritage Ottawa because as the national capital region, we have the preponderance of significant national historic sites and FIBRO designated buildings in our city. Plus they are the uber national historic sites, the national icons like the Moore Memorial and the Parliament buildings. And it's important for Canadians to find these as places to celebrate and places to manifest what they think. So I think we have there, each organization will probably have a message that helps to reinforce the group message.
Yeah, no, that's great, Leslie. So that's definitely, and we want to make sure there's a good cross-section of representation at committee. So we'll be in touch on that as well, and working through John Aldag to make sure that we that we don't miss that opportunity to be represented at the committee hearings. So any other comments about the engagement strategy? I see people indicating their interest in being part of the group of signatories, so that's great. There is a good question. I'm wondering, Mark, if you are the best suited to answer that question from Rebecca about whether the legislation allows for the protection of sites located on First Nation reserves. I feel like they are excluded if I checked my definitions.
Quick answer, Natalie, is I'd have to look that up.
Yeah. So maybe we'll, go ahead, Christina.
Yeah, my read is that there's that one clause when they're talking about the register, there's a very important clause in there that I think is wonderful, actually, which allows for the determination of heritage value, whatever that could be, by Indigenous peoples, and they can post those to the register without going through any other process. And I assume that applies to First Nations, because these sites on the First Nation. And I think this is really, I think it's a sort of follow-up of the proposal that I made to the Envy Committee about Indigenous registrars, because I've always worried about this issue.
Yes.
But I think that one clause is quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
So
No,
I think it's, I don't know the number of it. Is it like 35 or something like that? It's a bit longer. I can't remember, but you can find it there when you're in the public register system section.
yeah, I'm just looking quickly at the definitions here, and it says, it talks about a federal historic place located on federal lands. But federal lands does not include reserves as defined in the Indian Act. So it's a great question, Rebecca. We may need to, we probably can't figure it out live, but we can look at this and tell you what we think, and it may end up being something that we do need to question in our document. So thanks so much for that good question. So anything else anyone would like to add? I think we're at the end of our discussion on Bill C-23 for today. I just want to thank everyone for participating.
I believe
Catherine
Catherine
Yeah,
has a comment.
Yep, go ahead, Catherine.
Sorry, actually, my question is really quite a simple one, and I may actually have missed the answer. In terms of gathering support for all this, I'm sure there are a number of organizations and sites and so on that have not been following this very closely. How are we collectively contacting them to get them to become signatories to something that that they'll need some explanation on, but that their voices would be really helpful to up the numbers.
Yeah, so no, it's a good question. We've been trying to keep, I mean, our network has been getting information about this through our newsletter. So we've shared links to the bill and shared links, invitations to these gatherings. I see some suggestions of other organizations to reach out to. Yeah, no, that's something that came up early on. I don't know if we'd gotten around to doing that, but we may want to have another gathering actually closer to the point of this bill getting to second reading. When we do, I think we felt we were close at this moment to be sending out our document. But in our discussions last week, it led to a bit more thinking about what the process should be and the desire to check in with MP John Aldag before we went further. So that's a possibility for all of us to make sure that we're reaching out to organizations that we know. I think the trust has a pretty comprehensive mailing list through email of heritage organizations in Canada, but our provincial partner organizations, I'm sure, has a bigger list that drills down to the local. So it's great suggestions coming through here in the chat. So we'll capture the recording of this session. We also preserve the chat and the Q&A so we can go back and look at these comments and questions and organizations being identified to be consulted. Great. Any other comments? Thanks so much. Maybe we'll just wrap it up at this moment. So just I think our couple of slides, just reminding people about our Regeneration Works, the newsletter. If you're not already getting the National Trust newsletters, it's a great way to stay in touch with issues like this that affect everyone across the country. We've got a membership offer. If you're not a member of the trust, a special 30% discount if you'd like to join up. And there's the new member code that you can use on our website. And then finally, just a real thank you to the members of the working group. We'll share the names of all of these individuals and organizations in our follow-up email. They've certainly been an extraordinary group working together to pull these recommendations together. And thanks to Chris Weeb on the trust team and Holly Boulay in the background making this webinar work. So just thanks so much, and we'll be in touch. À la prochaine. Bonne journée.